I forgot how to rein it in. I know exactly what to say to it. If you could think like you always did, I would have never walked away from this.
How many of you are satisfied? You can clap. Satisfied with the results of the Epstein investigation? Clap.
That was Laura Ingraham asking a whole crowd of young conservatives to clap if they believe the Trump administration's claims about the Epstein files. So that's going to be today's focus, a trip to Epstein Island. This is Claire Potter.
And I'm Neil J. Young.
And we are here to sort out what is now the conspiracy theory. It has displaced Pizzagate. It has displaced the JFK assassination. Epstein forever, right, Neil?
Seems like it. Certainly doing a lot of messing up at a coalition that was maybe not held together too tightly, but we'll get into that.
We will indeed get into that. So let's start with the news, Neil. Today's news begins with Donald Trump's polling underwater. Fabrizio Ward, a Trump-leaning polling firm, warns actually that this could drag the rest of the Republican Party down. Surprise, surprise. The generic Republican in swing districts is down 3 points following passage of the budget bill and down 7 points among motivated voters, which is actually kind of an important figure here. What's the issue? Obamacare. Nearly 8 in 10 voters, which is 2/3 of Trump voters and 3/4 of swing voters, are in favor of the tax credits that subsidize insurance purchased from the federal government and the healthcare exchanges. These tax credits, unlike the Medicaid changes, are set to expire at the end of 2025, so they will impact the 2026 midterms. But extending the tax credit, should the Republicans back down on this and pass a bill that foils Trump, would give Republicans a 6-point edge in the 2026 midterms. Neil, what are we to think of this?
Well, I think there's actually a lot of meat here to chew on. I mean, there's a lot that can be sort of pulled out of this and interpreted. One of it is just like, too bad that election isn't taking place this week, right? I think that it would be disastrous for Republicans. And the big question is, what does this look like more than a year from now when we actually have midterms? And how do things shift between now and then in terms of like legislation that's put forward and also conservative media spin that like handles this story and other stories going into the 2026 midterms? I also think that, this is one of those pieces of evidence that reminds us that a good chunk of Trump supporters are folks who voted for Obama or liked a lot of things that Obama did. And the sort of like complicated nature of the coalition that, gathered itself behind Trump, I think is revealed in polling around this and particularly the way in which Obamacare sort of opens up a lot of the complexity of the group of Trump supporters, which I think also ties to the Epstein conspiracy that we'll get to in a bit. But what is your thinking about this and what it means for political consequences right now and in a midterm that's more than a year away?
Well, I think we're going to see a lot of deflection. And I think the Epstein thing, which we just can't stop talking about, even though we're not there yet, the Epstein thing is not the deflection that the Trump White House wanted. They are trying to deflect in other ways. They will try to shift the conversation back to immigration over and over and over again. Even though Trump is now underwater on immigration, he is less underwater on immigration than on any other topic. So expect stories about undocumented people who have murdered people in grisly ways. Expect rape dramas. Expect a lot of sensational news that will be pushed by right-leaning outlets and by online influencers. And we'll talk about this a little more later. But listeners need to be aware there is a network of online influencers whose job it is to go on X and sheet over and over and over again. Sheet is spelled Xeedt as opposed to tweet, and to sort of push out ideas that maybe have a little legs. So I think we're going to see the Trump administration pushing the conversation away from healthcare over and over again. But I think we're going to see an awful lot of very nervous Republican congressmen in swing districts trying to push Mike Johnson to do something about this.
Yeah,
What
that
do you
seems
think?
like it. Yeah, definitely so. And I think, the amplification of that particular anti-immigrant message, on social media spaces and also in conservative, traditional conservative media outlets, it's going to, like, I think we haven't even seen the full limits of that yet. And it's going to get overwhelming and it's going to get really, really ugly. I think there's a question though of like, what are the limits of the audience for that? Obviously, there's a
Mm-hmm.
core base of supporters for Trump that is really, motivated around this issue. But like the suburban voter who, has immigration concerns, are they going to like the sort of ugly direction this goes in and sort of the nonstop focus on it? I think that's an open question.
Right. And Republican influencers have this sort of dark humor thing that they do that, suburban voters are fine with immigration policy as long as they don't lose their gardeners, as long as they don't lose their cooks, and so on.
Right.
But they underestimate how profoundly integrated many undocumented people are in the communities where they live. There are some friends of mine in Florida who have a whole Mexican family who works for them, who has been in this country for decades, who have little businesses that put them in touch with tons of people in the community who are, I am quite sure, Trump voters. And when you put a face on immigrants, all of a sudden people's ideas about how they should be treated changes.
Yes, and I also think it, it's sort of a question of which face becomes the dominant face in the politics of this. So
Right.
pre-election, Laken Riley, right? That's the face of this issue for conservative voters or for voters who are, open to supporting Trump, right? This sort of blonde woman who's murdered, like she's the face of this story. But what happens when actually he's the president and the story that's overwhelming the news are the ICE raids and children and mothers, and those profiles and those stories and those images become the face of this. I mean, there'll be more Laken Rileys that they turn up and try to turn into the dominating story, but can that overwhelm the images that we're seeing now of like children in cages? Like, I don't think that's going to work with a lot of, again, suburban voters who are uncomfortable with the excesses of what the state is doing right now.
Right. No, and just to put a bow on this story, which we will be following, of course, into the next election. I was listening to Mark Cuban the other day on Pod Save America, and one of the things he was saying is that the Republicans could have avoided all of this by saying, here are the 1,000 most heinous people that we want to round up and get out of the country. And that would have been consistent with their law and order message before the last election. Now, they are really not in control of the images that are proliferating. You sort of snatch people off the street, off the sidewalk, at work, at school, and so on and so forth. All of a sudden, we have images of weeping children screaming, "Mommy, mommy, mommy," as mommy is being dragged by masked men into a car.
Yeah. I mean, I think Cuban's point is right, but it also assumes that that's what this was about. This was ever
Right,
about, and it
right,
wasn't.
right. Yeah. Well, and Cuban argued, just to represent him properly, that actually it would have been good for the Democrats to say, yes, we're behind you. The 1,000 top enemies, we do have to get rid of them. We do have to get rid of these gang members. And that would have given Democrats a kind of moral ground to stand
Mm.
on when people were just being arrested randomly,
Hmm.
which I think is interesting. Okay, so on a slightly cheerier note, on Tuesday, Andrew Cuomo announced that he will run for mayor of New York City. Why is this cheery? We'll get to that in a minute. Following a stunning primary loss to a relative newcomer, State Assemblyman Zoran Mamdani, who we should devote an episode to at some point. Okay, here's the cheerful part. This makes 4 major candidates on the ballot, along with incumbent Mayor Eric Adams and Republican nominee Curtis Sliwa. Nobody likes these other 3 guys who are basically going to split the anti-Mamdani
Right.
vote between them. However, Cuomo, who has a lot of backing from a lot of really rich people who don't like socialists, has promised a more energetic campaign than he delivered the first time around. Neil?
I mean, first of all, I actually don't even know where to start with this, but I think,
Right?
it seems like all of this just sets up Mamdani to have a pretty
Yeah.
easy victory here. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe things shift before election day, but the fact that there's, you know, several candidates in this race, all of whom have a decent constituency behind them, seems like Mamdani wins in this scenario. I'm sort of surprised that, Wall Street billionaires are not doing more to get Adams out of the race and
Mm-hmm.
Sliwa as well. Although, I don't know how much they could do, but like it seems like there's pressure to be exerted there and sort of helping them consolidate behind Cuomo. But what does an energetic campaign from Cuomo look like? I
Mm-hmm.
saw the initial video he put out, which just seems like he smiled a couple of times. Is that the new Cuomo we're getting? I don't know. I'm kind of glad to not be voting in New York these days, but we'll see how this plays out.
Yeah, I mean, if I were voting in New York, I would vote for Mamdani, hands down. I think he's a really good example of someone who a lot of young people got behind, not for symbolic reasons, but for real reasons. And one of the things that I thought was interesting is the New York Times ran a piece on all the candidates before the primary and asked them, who was your favorite mayor in the history of New York City? And nearly all of them said Fiorello LaGuardia.
Hmm.
Now, Fiorello LaGuardia was not a socialist. However, what he did is he became mayor on the promise to build schools. He built something like 12 high schools during his time as mayor. Before he became mayor, high school students were only going to school half a day because there were too many of them. He built colleges, he built public arts centers. He created all of these things that actually made New York, New York. So, on the one hand, I thought it was really sad that all these people couldn't think of a mayor less than 100 years ago
Yeah.
who was their favorite mayor. On the other hand, I thought, well, this is what Mamdani is doing. He's offering ideas about what could revitalize New York as a place for young people to live and make a career in.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's got a lot of ideas, and I think those ideas are exciting to lots and lots of voters, clearly. And I also think they represent a policy agenda that more Democrats might think about embracing in
Mm-hmm.
terms of reaching voters and energizing them. I think, as a lot of people have pointed out, the job of New York City mayor, in a lot of ways, if not chiefly so, is an operations role. And so I think, sort of the ideology aside, there is legitimate concern from a lot of folks about him being a 34-year-old who hasn't really run anything before. Now, one can do that with a great administration team. And, it may be that he really staffs up in a way that puts those operational worries away. But I think that that's also part of the conversation of those who are opposed to Mamdani that's getting a little bit lost in the focus on him being a socialist and billionaires being upset about him being the front runner and all that.
Yeah. And of course, there is some talk about his support for pro Palestinian causes,
Yes.
which is worrisome to some people. It doesn't exactly worry me. And I think, we're sort of at a place in all of this where we need to start separating the foreign policy agenda and our humanitarian beliefs about what is going on in Gaza and in the Middle East more generally. We need to separate that from local issues because a lot of voters are not voting on Israel Palestine all the time. It's a sliver of voters, and they're an important sliver of voters, and I care about them. But I actually think Mamdani is a good person with certain kinds of political affiliations that wouldn't be mine. But that's true of most candidates, right?
Yeah, I mean, no one's going to find their perfect candidate. I do think that I agree with your point about sort of thinking about this in a more complex way than I think it's often rendered in our politics right now. I do think that there's also legitimate concern that he hasn't spoken out more forcefully about anti-Semitic violence in the city. And he's made some gestures in that direction, but I certainly understand a lot of voters feeling like it hasn't been enough. and that there's real concerns about the escalation of violence in the city and what that would mean nationally to have New York City be a place that, where anti-Semitic violence might become more commonplace. I mean, this is also, imagining a lot of things that may not come to be, but all of that to say is, I think it's understandable that there are a lot of voters in New York who haven't been assured by him around this.
I agree. And particularly given how recent the campus uprisings
Yeah.
were and how much that became a focus for anti Semitic threats. There's been a lot of stuff going on in the schools of young teachers sort of doing things in class
Yeah.
that parents found to be anti Semitic. And I think if Mamdani were smart, he would bring in an advisor on these issues or a team of advisors to both show goodwill and also educate himself a little bit about how other people feel. And that's where I always get sort of impatient with people who don't understand how deeply anti-Semitism cuts in a place like New York City, which is these feelings come from real events. I mean, I remember in 2016 there were Holocaust survivors who were like packing suitcases when Trump got elected.
Yeah.
So these fears are not just historical. They are very present for a great many people.
Yes, certainly.
Okay, so we've been following this story throughout the week, which is the congressional rescission bill, a request from the White House to cut $9+ billion from the budget. That was focused on foreign aid, but it also took aim at an institution that Republican presidents have been trying to kill since Nixon, actually. A paper this morning was talking about George H.W. Bush, but it's since Nixon, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. On Wednesday, one response to this was from a woman named Ann Philbin, the former director of the Hammer Museum at UCLA. She was awarded the prestigious Getty Prize, which comes with a $500,000 award. She gave the entire sum to NPR and Los Angeles Public Media. Yeah. And I think, that's what we're going to be looking at is asking billionaires to take some responsibility for what they put into motion here. Neil, can you explain to our listeners what the Corporation for Public Broadcasting does and why it's such a big deal outside metropolitan areas?
Yeah, I mean, it does so much, and I think I won't even be able to speak to all of it because I think probably a lot of it is not necessarily even known by those of us who pay close attention to it. But, I think there's a sort of visible aspects of it, NPR and the like, that, people are familiar with, especially, and we've talked about this a couple of times on here, the way in which it provides, especially to rural and non-metropolitan areas, sort of media deserts, really. It is the lone player, and it includes things like weather information and other sorts of information and press that is vital to those communities. And so I think the decimation of that is something that is going to be profound, and I think will in some ways maybe complicate some of the politics around this. Like if you're a Republican legislator whose district includes much of such areas, like, do you start getting a lot of heat from your constituents because they don't have the access to information that they've relied on for so long? That seems like it might happen. I also just want to sort of pick up on what you said about billionaire donors and the like. I mean, I hope they will come forward and write some big checks now. I also just this morning went to read an article on pbs.org, and as I went to read it, a pop-up screen came that was sort of, federal funding has been withdrawn. We need your dollars now. So obviously there's going to be a huge amount of fundraising that's done. And I think, Americans will step forward and be supportive. In a way, though, doesn't that sort of justify or prove conservatives' point that like it should have never been funded by the government, but should have always relied on private donors, et cetera, et cetera?
That's a really good point, Neil. And it's something I've been kind of chewing over because one of my favorite people in the world, who's a man named Douglas Bennett, who was the president of Wesleyan University, he came to Wesleyan via the State Department after a short stint at NPR. And one of the things he accomplished at NPR was making NPR the national network. And we should say these individual community radio stations are actually different from the national network. But he made NPR almost independent of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So one of the reasons that CPB and PBS, which are the sort of big producers of the various shows that we're most familiar with, one of the reasons they're kind of going to be okay is their fundraising apparatus has really buffered them from
Yes.
this kind of thing. But how the Corporation for Public Broadcasting works is that Congress makes an allocation to CPB, which then distributes that money to the different stations around the country, most of which are rural stations. They then use that money both to sustain their operating costs and to buy programming from NPR and PBS, but they also use it to do local programming. So, in many places, it's the only source of local news because, as we know, newspapers have collapsed. So, I wanted to ask you this question, Neil. Do you think actually the Trump administration specifically wants to access to information among its base? Because this is going to hit their base harder than the Democratic base.
Well, I think they want to divert access to information to Trump loyalist media outlets. And so, yes, I think it's, important that the information pipeline get consolidated in a way that sort of only comes out of Trump affiliated places. But it's wild to think that, a good chunk of this stuff, which is stuff like weather announcements, could become so sort of politicized, but I think like it's being sacrificed on the altar of this bigger goal, which is to eliminate nonpartisan or non-Trump loyal information that's getting to its base.
Yeah. And, there is also the line that, this is just a bunch of liberal programming. I mean, the idea that actually there could be children's programming that is just for children and it doesn't have a politics seems to be anathema to the Republican Party. But I would also like to say, the only access I had to conservative ideas as a child, real ideas as opposed to conversation, was public broadcasting in southern Idaho, which
Mm.
broadcast William F. Buckley's Firing Line every week. And my grandfather was devoted to Firing Line. So I used to watch William F. Buckley as a child and as a young teenager. And it really educated me as to what conservative ideas looked like and what it meant for people to have those conversations. He often also had liberals on his show who he would fight with. So you would see before you a serious exchange of political ideas that, I wouldn't have had access to otherwise. So, all right. Finally, the conspiracy theories. Neil's like, can we get to Jeffrey Epstein, please? So I think the place to start with Jeffrey Epstein is on the role of conspiracy theories in the GOP. Would you agree with me, Neil?
I think that seems like the right place to start because it can help us think about both the moment now, but also the long history here, because I think the long history here is really instructive in the way that conspiracism has been an animating force on the right. And that's not to say that only conservatives are conspiracists, but that conspiracy, I think, works in a different way than it does on the left to mobilize a particular voter for the GOP.
Yeah. And of course, one of the most famous essays in this regard, which was part of a collection, was Richard Hofstadter's 1964 essay, The Paranoid Style in American Politics. And he really traces conspiracism back to 19th century populism, which he wrote a whole book about. And so the assumption has been, and I just want to pick up on what you were saying, Neil, that conspiracy theories are really right wing, but research suggests that's not true and that it depends what conspiracies you're talking about. So could you give our listeners an example of a left wing conspiracy theory?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in a lot of ways, probably the average viewer is much more familiar with the conspiracies of the right. But if you think about things on the left, a lot of this has to do with Trump, Trump Russia hoax, Trump's connection to January 6th, Trump's, COVID stuff. What are some of the historical examples, though, that we would think? I mean, one of them is the JFK assassination. That tends to track a little bit more on the left than on the right. I think also ideas about the invention of crack cocaine as a CIA plant to destroy Black communities. What else will we think about historically here?
Well, something that I think about all the time is the Tawana Brawley case,
Hmm.
and which was then determined to be a false accusation, in which a young African American woman in the Bronx accused a series of white politicians of having kidnapped her and abused her sexually and so on. It was really a grisly and horrible story, particularly since it's perfectly obvious something happened to that child. But, that played on a reasonable belief among poor and working class Black people that white politicians were out to get them. So why wouldn't they use this child in the terrible way they did, and also the correct history that white men had frequently raped Black women and not been held to account for it. So that's one I would come up with.
Yeah, and I'll add one more as a way to say something bigger, which is, Hurricane Katrina and President Bush, and, that the Bush administration purposely opened the levees, or, led to their, helped their destruction in order to destroy New Orleans. But here's the thing. I think that, like, when you look at this from a like bird's eye view, you can say, okay, yes, there's conspiracies that are more supported by those on the right versus conspiracies that are more held by those on the left. Yes, stipulated. But I think the important thing here is not so much that like there are conspiracies that are sort of left wing oriented versus right wing oriented, but like how do those conspiracies actually operate within those voting demographics? Like, I do not think that conspiracies about George W. Bush or about Tawana Brawley have motivated Democratic voters in the way that those parallel are those, the examples on the right mobilize voters, especially those who are supportive of Trump. I mean, is there an important difference here in terms of like the activation that these conspiracies bring about? I think there is.
Okay, I think there is too. And I'm going to put my theory out there because one of the things we know from a study by Pew Research is that the subset of Republicans, which is about 30% of them, who do not watch Fox News or listen to talk radio, were dramatically less likely to believe in false narratives than Republicans who did. And one of the things I would argue, and I want to give a nod to our mutual friend, Nikki Hemmer,
Yeah.
who has written a whole book about this, actually several books about this, is the rise of right-wing media and the centrality of conspiracy theories to populist rants against privileged elites.
Yes. And I think it's so important to talk about that universe, the sort of media universe that is putting those stories sort of front and center in terms of its audience and its message to its audience, and the way in which those in many instances sort of dominate coverage for periods of time and are used to sort of consolidate, or rather to create a conservative identity, right? To engage in these conspiracies is to show oneself to be a conservative, as it is made through this media machine. And so the ways in which this becomes sort of core to identity seems incredibly important here too. And I think that's like where we're seeing a lot of the fracturing here with the Epstein stuff,
Right,
you
right.
know?
Well, and let's recap where this is coming from. Before Epstein, we had Pizzagate.
Hmm.
Okay, so we see the idea that there are these rings of pedophiles at the heart of government. And I want to just make a distinction here, which may seem like an idiotic distinction, but Jeffrey Epstein was not a pedophile. He was an ephebophile. This may make no difference to everyone else, but actually, people who are sexually interested in teenagers and young adults are known as ephebophiles, not pedophiles. Pedophiles are interested in little children. Okay, so, but Pizzagate was specifically organized around the abuse of little children at a pizza parlor by Hillary Clinton and the people around her. So, moving pedophilia to the center of Republican discourse meant that it became a cudgel to use against anybody. And along with this, we began to see, as the facts about Epstein came out, and they are truly grisly and truly awful, and he and Ghislaine Maxwell, who fortunately is in jail, hurt a lot of people really badly, the kind of hurt that does not go away. And they did it because they were rich, and they did it because they were politically connected. So the Pizzagate thing kind of morphed into Epstein Gate, like the idea that there was this client list. And if that list was revealed, we were going to see all of the Democratic elites exposed for the vile creatures that they are. But at the same time, every once in a while, these photographs of Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein would pop up, and we would see stories saying, well, actually, Donald Trump once said that he really liked Jeffrey Epstein, but he hadn't really talked to him in 10 years or something like that. So there has always been a ticking time bomb at the heart of the Jeffrey Epstein thing. And it has been fanned by people like Laura Ingraham, with whom we began the episode, and other conservative influencers like Tucker Carlson. Elon Musk has jumped in on this. So, Neil, can we get to the part of this story that is the leopards eating faces party, where suddenly the leopards are hungering after Donald Trump's face? How did that happen?
And how did they not see that that's where it was leading to ultimately?
Right.
And I think, God, a lot of ink has been spilled on all the ways that, Trump's supporters and his like most ardent base engages in all sorts of rationalizations and denials in order to continue to be true believers in him. But I think it's particularly interesting how this doesn't seem to be working, at least with a contingency of that, like a portion of them. But is the question how did they not all see this coming? How could it not lead to this place? I mean, I think I don't understand that, because I actually thought it was very surprising to me that there was any engagement of the Epstein story on the behalf of Trump and his water carriers, because of those associations with him. Whether or not they were actually anything really bad, just the fact that there was a connection there seemed it was worth avoiding, in the way that Pizzagate doesn't implicate Trump, right? So why does Epstein, I mean, was it that the visibility of Democratic faces around Epstein was just it was like catnip that they just couldn't avoid?
Well, I think part of it was Epstein's association with major universities. He gave a lot of money to places like Harvard and I
Yeah.
believe the University of Pennsylvania.
Yes.
He was involved with a lot of research projects. So part of what Epstein liked, as far as I can tell, was being around smart people and sort of basking in the glow of being an effective altruist or something like that. We still don't really know where a lot of Epstein's money came from, but he gave substantial amounts of money to people and institutions that are part of the liberal elite. And I think if you position that next to the fact that Trump has played his cards very cannily in terms of being a rich guy who is part of a wealthy elite, but also able to connect to poor and working class people as if he were not. I think this may be kind of tipping the scales for him. And there's a contradiction at the heart of all that the Epstein case seems to elevate, right?
Yeah, that feels really right and smart, right? That Trump takes that money and that power and portrays it in a populist message that's anti-elite, anti traditional institutions, even as he's caught up in all those things as well. Epstein, I mean, is there also a Jewish factor to this as well?
I
I
am
think that
so
has to
glad
be
you brought
part of
that up.
this.
Yes, I am so glad you brought that up. Yes. Tell me
That
what you think.
Epstein, the Jewish New Yorker, again, with
Right.
the Harvard connections and
Right.
all that, it just is such it taps so easily into some of Trump's base's worst prejudices and phobias. And also, I think, ties into ideas about Jewish people being money handlers and all the rest. And so I think, all of that is at work here. But let's get to the part about this potentially breaking or at least exposing the cracks in the broad Trump coalition.
Well, okay. So I think there are two ways of looking at it. One is to look at the face of MAGA, which is these influencers, people like Laura Ingraham, Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon, all of these influencers. Laura Loomer is a biggie.
Yeah.
Who have actually, and I just want to underline this, I think we talked about this last week, they've made a lot of money off of this conspiracy. So there's a lot at stake for them to keep it alive, for them to abruptly turn around and say, President Trump is absolutely right, this is a nothing burger, would mean decades of money they have made off of gullible people is in question. And a kind of rage at these folks would be reasonable. But I think someone like Laura Loomer actually does believe in the conspiracy, and Steve Bannon may as well, and Tucker Carlson may as well. So they have not been happy about how they've been treated by particularly Pam Bondi in this regard, that they have been sort of pushed off with redacted documents and promises of things that they're then told don't exist. And I think they're not happy about how they've been treated, and they have a lot to say about it.
Yeah, they're definitely not happy with it. I think in part because they think, listen, we mobilized millions and millions of people for your benefit around this message that are animated in large part because of there are folks who are really, really devoted to this story, who know every in and out of it, who have spent their time for a decade now highly online pursuing this story and knowing like all the aspects of it. And those folks are overwhelmingly Trump supporters that have been sort of consolidated and organized through these handful of conservative media influencers. And then to feel like they're being played by this administration for whom they are its most stalwart, advocates, that can't feel good, And I think it's so interesting to watch how this is playing out, because there is a portion of this demographic that seems to have seen the light, although, who knows how this all ultimately plays out, but there's a big chunk of them that are just remaining loyal to Trump and seeing that sort of debate play out, because like Charlie Kirk and others are, fully in the tank for Trump around this and are doing his work and dismissing this and why did anyone ever care about Epstein and all the rest. There's one other point I was going to make which has escaped me, so I'll toss it back to you and maybe I'll remember it.
Well, okay, so Steve Bannon is warning that Trump could lose 10% of his base, and he translated that into 40 midterm House seats, which, if that were true, that would be one of the biggest slams and reversals of the House of Representatives in the last 30 or 40 years. Equivalent to what happened when Newt Gingrich took the House back in the 90s, which I think they won 36 seats or something like that. So that's a lot of seats. But I think we're talking swing districts here. We're talking people who vote for Trump, but if in fact they're disillusioned with Trump, they're not going to vote at all. So I think there is something about how the GOP wins elections that is really at stake in this Epstein thing. I wanted to shift it back to the anti-Semitism just for a second, because some of these influencers and certainly some politicians like Marjorie Taylor Greene are deeply associated with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And I'm thinking about the role George Soros has played.
Yes.
The constant references to Hollywood, substitute Jews for Hollywood.
Yes.
Banks, substitute Jews for banks. And so I think that there is a kind of anti-Semitism that is hardwired into the MAGA base that the Epstein business brings up at precisely the moment that the Republican Party is trying to ride anti-Semitism into a takeover of the major universities of the United States.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important way to perhaps interpret where some of these fractures are appearing and where the divisions emerge. If Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene are the ones that sort of pull particular portion away, these are folks who are in the daily business of putting anti-Semitic thoughts forward. So that seems to be a really smart way of thinking how this is breaking down. David French, the conservative anti-Trumper, commented on Twitter a couple days ago that this was the first time in a decade that many of Trump's supporters realized he's a pathological liar. And I think that, that is such an important observation to bring into this, because I think it is, that tweet sort of just almost like took my breath away when I read it, because it is to be reminded, this thing that we take as a given, that we think everyone knows, which is that he is a pathological lying scam artist, is not at all believed by so many folks. I think a lot of us think that, like, oh, they like him in spite of all these things. And it's like, that's not even the case at all. So there's a portion of his base who have, for the first time, had the idea that he might not always tell the truth. And also there is going to be a enormous part of his base that doesn't see this either, as any sort of evidence of his mendacity.
Yeah, and there's a whole discourse that is organized around exactly what you're talking about, which is Trump's base making sense of his lies and
Yes.
failures and errors, and it is called three-dimensional chess.
Yeah.
Okay, so when some of these things are colliding with each other, what you'll see is influencers online saying the libs don't understand that Trump is always playing three-dimensional chess while they're playing checkers. And the idea that actually maybe there is no three-dimensional chess here. I think what you're saying is really important. I want to throw out a couple of news items that help lead us through this as well. One is that Pam Bondi is up to her neck in problems because she, of course, had promised that she was going to release the Epstein client list. And then she reversed herself and said, well, there actually is no Epstein client list. And that's when things began to break apart. Trump has made a public statement supporting Pam Bondi, but insiders say she's hanging on to her job by a thread. Probably didn't help that Dan Bongino had a complete meltdown at the end of last week, wouldn't even come to work. He was so mad at Pam Bondi and was basically saying it's either me or Pam Bondi, which Dan Bongino is not good enough at his job that he should threaten people with stuff like that. On Monday, House Democrats, in a, I don't know, fun moment, introduced legislation that would force the Trump administration to release the Epstein files. Only one Republican voted for it, but Republicans are now toying with a non-binding resolution that would preempt such a bill. And on top of all of this, the Wall Street Journal published a story last night that purported to present to the public a birthday book that had been put together for Jeffrey Epstein's 50th birthday by Ghislaine Maxwell, which includes a letter from Trump that I think it's probably accurate to just call it bawdy. It's not obscene, it's just bawdy and kind of dumb, but the letter alludes to a lot of secrets. Neil, I've just tossed a bunch of stuff out. Grab one of those balls and do something with it.
Yeah, I want to pick up on the Democratic legislation around
Okay.
this. I may be wrong here. I'm interested in what you think, but this to me seems a absolute wrong way to handle this opportunity.
Right.
That the Democrats should sort of sit back and allow this to fester on the right, and to build pressure on some Republicans in Congress to do something about this. If Democrats lead this, it becomes easy to make this a solely partisan issue again, that becomes what the conversation is about in conservative media. So even folks like Tucker Carlson and others might turn their own gaze towards the Democrats, like, want to do this, and this shows that actually all of this is just a political winch hunt and all the rest. So I think that Democrats should sit back on this, should allow it to develop on the right, maybe work in the back channels about like getting legislation forward via some, Republican legislators, but like to take this up and to put this forward. And obviously we see the results of that, have only one Republican vote for it, seems to me to really mishandle the opportunity of this. But maybe I'm wrong, Claire.
Well, I'm not sure you are wrong, Neil. And I think just letting the leopards start eating faces
Yeah.
and see what happens. While maybe the Democrats could actually work on some policy proposals for 2026, just like take
That
the
too.
time to do your homework while everybody
Yes.
else is going to the football game. But I would also say that there's another piece of this that's interesting, which is the whole Murdoch news empire. On the one hand, we've got the Wall Street Journal doing investigative reporting, and Trump says the letter is fake. All these influencers are on X today saying, oh, it doesn't even sound like Trump. JD Vance has said, doesn't even sound like Trump. Well, duh, the man's never written anything in his life. It was written by
Exactly.
somebody else. He certainly doesn't draw. But I would also say it's interesting because Murdoch is attacking with one vehicle and he's holding his fire with the other vehicle, which is Fox News. And Laura Ingraham went on the air the other night promising something about Epstein that actually never happened. So obviously, some producer jumped in and said, no, 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 we're not talking about Epstein tonight. That's off the
Uh-huh.
table.
Uh-huh.
And then we've got Megyn Kelly, who no longer works at Fox, who's sort of like the anti Fox because of what happened with being sexually harassed by Roger Ailes. On the other hand, on her streaming show, she had said, yeah, there's some there with the Epstein thing, and they have some explaining to do. So the MAGA media universe is suddenly jumping off the train tracks a little bit, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, and I think it just points to that this has been, like you said a few moments ago, that this has been a huge money-making career opportunity for
Right,
so many of the folks that we're talking about.
right,
And it will continue to be so. And it might be that the money to be made and the career to be built from it is in not staying sort of organized around one particular message on it, but like taking all the different channels, and you just bring your particular base along with the one that's interested in that particular message that you put out there. But like, we might get some real variation here within the larger universe of conservative media, that everyone just sort of picks their lane on this.
right. And what's getting lost in this, in all outlets, but this one, is how many women were really, really hurt. And, all of the talk about like, was Trump capable of this? Was Trump capable of that? I think somebody said this is what you get when you put a rapist in the White House. And just to be clear, for legal reasons, I believe he was convicted of sexual abuse, not rape, in the civil trial. Nevertheless, there's a lot going on with this guy and how he treats women. And I think this surfacing might sort of draw attention to those things again. What do you think, Neil?
It might, it should. As you said, there's many, many women who have had their lives ruined by being part of this story. And, I think there has been some good attention to that here and there through the mountains that have been reported on this. But it does feel like that's really lost in the moment right now.
Right,
But that it
right.
would probably, be worthwhile for all of us to remember what's at the heart of this story, which is a lot of people victimized in
Yep.
really horrific ways.
Right. Well, and this is what happens to your brain if you don't have any feminism, because all of these women who spoke out and the many who didn't speak out had two things in common. They were white and they were poor. They were so poor. And they recruited other poor girls to get $100 bills from these people and so on. And because the Republicans have no feminism, there's no way for them to talk about that and to shift the onus back on Jeffrey Epstein. Because the one thing you might say about Trump, and I don't actually know whether this is accurate or not, but except for walking in on the Miss Teen USA dressing room thing, in general, he directed his lewd violence toward paid sex workers or women of his own social class.
Hmm.
And so the Epstein thing actually is different in that regard. And if anybody was intelligent, they would talk about that. Neil, there's one other thing I'd like to sort of drop a penny on, which is there was something this morning in the New York Times, and it's been racing around social media, trying to explain why Trump has swollen ankles and bruising on his hands. And part of what is being said about this is, oh, he has to shake so many hands and it bruises his hands because he takes an aspirin for his health every day. And he has venous insufficiency, which a lot of older people do, blah, blah, blah. But, I was looking at this and I was thinking, these are also symptoms of congestive heart failure.
Right.
Did you have that thought too?
Yeah, well, I mean, I saw lots of doctors
Mm,
online saying that, and I
mm-hmm.
thought, well, that seems legitimate.
Yeah,
I don't tend to love these sort of online speculations
right.
about people's health, but it does. I mean, the pictures here are striking. There's nothing about him that I think speaks to a healthy existence. I think a lot of folks have wondered, I mean, he's a very old man. He leads a very unhealthy life. He has a very unhealthy lifestyle in many ways. And it's not surprising that, he might be showing some of the signs of that physically. It still makes me a little nervous to see these sort of online
Sure.
diagnoses, but it
Well, we
seems like
don't
something's
know.
happening there. Yeah, we don't know.
Something is happening there. And the reason I was thinking about it in relation to the Epstein thing is it is a way of lying to appear to be telling the truth, to appear to be disclosing something. And this is how the information is being presented. The president is making a full disclosure of this health information
Yeah.
and nothing to look at, when in fact we know that Trump has lied relentlessly about the most ridiculous things for years, like how tall he is, how much he weighs, blah 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 blah. I mean, think how much more of a sympathetic character he would be if he were able to say, yeah, I've had a really tough time keeping weight off and it's really, really hard.
Absolutely. But I mean, that would be for him to be an entirely different person than he is. I think just the other thing that I would add here is like, the speculation about his physical health. There's also been direct questions, even again recently, about his cognitive decline. And the White House, especially through the spokesperson, has just, lost their minds over that.
Right.
And have berated reporters for asking this again. So you have, multiple conversations about health and decline when it comes to the president. And it's just interesting how often those questions get turned on the reporters and also directed back to, Biden.
Right. Right. I know. I was
I mean,
seeing
like,
some Hunter Biden laptop stuff on the internet today, and I was like, really, guys? You really think anybody even remembers who Hunter Biden is? Come on. You know,
seriously.
seriously. All right. So this is already going viral, but what else do we want to go viral this week that would actually be good for our listeners, Neil?
All right. Well, this would be great to go viral.
Okay.
It's a piece that came out a couple of weeks ago in The Atlantic. I've been meaning to talk about it. I'm going to talk about it this week. It is from a former student of mine, Duncan Hosey.
Yay.
Actually, wasn't a student of mine. He was an advisee of mine when I taught at Princeton.
Yay.
Duncan went on to, after graduating from Princeton, was a Marshall Scholar at Oxford, then went to Yale Law School, has worked at the ACLU. He's in a fellowship at Stanford Law School now. Really, really smart young man, and writes prolifically for lots of different outlets about the law and particularly about the Supreme Court. And he has this really smart piece in The Atlantic that came out a few weeks ago called "Liberals Are Going to Keep Losing at the Supreme Court, and they need to look elsewhere for constitutional change." It uses the two recent cases that I think we spoke about recently, Mahmoud v. Taylor and United States versus Scrimetti, and says, like, these are two cases that everyone knew liberals were going to lose.
Mm-hmm.
With the conservative majority that this court has, why are such cases being taken forward? And it uses those cases to sort of speak to the broader argument that, like, this is a conservative court that is not in any way going to advance any sort of liberal victories. And so liberals should be more strategic, and they should be mindful of the fact that this is a place in which not only victories can't be won, but actually terribly destructive defeats can happen. In the case of, like, the Maryland case that came out about we talked about it on here, Mahmoud v. Taylor, the Maryland school district that was having this fight over LGBTQ content in the school district. And Duncan points out that, like, a better path here would have been reaching some sort of compromise within that school district. Instead, the lawyers took that case to the Supreme Court. And so rather than this being some sort of compromise reached in one school district, devastating blow against LGBTQ rights was issued by the Supreme Court that then becomes a national template upon which more and more defeats around LGBTQ rights can be pursued. And so it's just such a smart point. It's really worth reading. And Duncan makes the argument and really urges liberals to look to other places to make advancements right now, or to focus its energies at state and local races, at school boards, at the policy level on which liberals can be effective given the current climate and current scenario. But the Supreme Court is not the place for that now. And that, like, we should sort of just concede that branch, or at least not pursue sort of political strategy through that branch right now. And he doesn't make this point, but it made me think about conservatives in the 90s, right? Who, we can't win the White House, and we don't seem to be doing really well on national elections. So what did they do? They turned to the local races. And, Ralph Reed and other conservative strategists were like, let's go win every school board. Let's go win every city council. And from there, let's build up a conservative revolution, which is exactly what they did. So anyway, we'll link to the piece in The Atlantic from Duncan, and read everything by him. He's great.
It's fantastic, Neil. I was having two thoughts. One is possibly one of the most underrated political thinkers of the 20th century was Phyllis Schlafly. And she says in A Choice, Not an Echo, which is 1964, the most important election you will ever cast a vote in is the election for your local school board.
That's right.
And then the other thing I was thinking of was Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health. And that was a case about whether the state of Mississippi could require Jackson Women's Health to conform to certain kinds of zoning and health and safety regulations, which of course was how legislatures were trying to shut down abortion clinics, was by forcing them to make expensive and difficult changes. But that's what the case was about. And not fighting that case might have put us in an entirely different place, or at least staved off what has happened now. So thank you for that, Neil. Sounds like a great article, and I'm looking forward to reading it. So my viral thing this week is a little different, but also in some ways just as serious. It is a documentary called My Mom, Jane, which is on HBO. I think it was released in March. And it is by actress and filmmaker Mariska Hargitay, who's really famous for Special Victims Unit and, a range of sort of middle brow television shows. Her mother was the actress Jane Mansfield. And there's very little out there to read or watch about Jane Mansfield, but it's an extremely poignant film for a couple of reasons. One being Jane had 5 children with at least 3 different men. And I'm going to hang that one out there because there's a mystery that gets unraveled in the course of this film. But she loved her children dearly. She loved her children. She loved animals. And most of all, she loved acting. And she comes along at about the same time that Marilyn Monroe is on the rise. And there's a certain kind of glamour being asked for. And, you look at it from a 21st century perspective and you can think, how is it that men could have really thought that, a helmet of blonde hair and all of that makeup and so on, was incredibly sexy, but they did. And that's what studio heads wanted. Mansfield became a huge star, mostly in a range of vehicles, much like Marilyn Monroe, that weren't good enough for her. And she really sort of cracks apart a little bit for 2 reasons. One is she wants to be taken seriously as an actress and an artist, and she can't make that happen. The second thing is she has one husband who sounds like a wonderful human being, a guy named Mickey Hargitay, who was a bodybuilder and basically Jane Mansfield's husband. And then she had a lot of other men who were cruel to her and beat her and so on. So it is an attempt by Mariska Hargitay to know her mother. Jane Mansfield dies in a car accident in, I think, 1969. 3 of her children with Mickey Hargitay are in the car. They're in the back seat of the car, and she's up front having an argument with her 3rd husband, who is her divorce attorney. And then the kids say, we woke up and, we saw a blonde woman leaning into the car, but it wasn't our mother. It was a nurse. And so Mariska was 3 when her mother was killed. So she really never knew her. And she makes the film by interviewing a lot of people who did know her mother, one of whom is the press agent who he never says he's gay, but he's got a rainbow flag hanging in the background and a little cup in rainbow colors that says love, which is actually just kind of fascinating. But it's a very, very moving film, both about a daughter's search for her mother and about family and about what happened to women in Hollywood in the 1950s. The height of success was to be this kind of roving sex symbol when actually you wanted to be something else. And Jane Mansfield spoke 3 languages.
Wow.
She was a concert pianist. She played the violin. I mean, she's really an extremely talented woman. And she got wedged into being, a sort of backup Marilyn Monroe.
Wow. I've been meaning to watch that. I'm a huge Mariska Hargitay fan. I love SVU. I once shared an ATM with Mariska
Whoa.
on Bleecker Street when I lived in the West Village. Yeah, I walked into like my local ATM, little thing, and she was the other person in there like getting money out of the ATM, and it's one of the like favorite moments of my life. But yeah, I've been meaning to watch that, but also a little nervous too, because even just watching the trailer, it seems so emotional, and so I feel like I need to be in the right state of mind to watch it. But I'm glad to hear your endorsement of it.
It's really, really good. And it says a lot about the film industry, but also the comparison between Jane Mansfield, who doesn't have feminism. I mean, she dies in 1969 as second wave feminism is just starting to percolate into popular culture. And it's that second wave feminism that will give her daughter, Mariska, a career as a detective, not as a sex symbol, but as a detective, and playing all kinds of women's roles that are meaty and have substance for her. So hard recommend on that one, Neil, and have a Kleenex box at hand.
Okay.
So Neil, I think that's all for this week. I'm sure there will be more breaking news about the Epstein case today, because they always like to dump these things on the weekends. So we'll get back together next week and pick up the story where we left off.
Sounds good. Have a great weekend.
You too, buddy. And that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. And you can follow us on Threads, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, and Instagram. Subscribe to Why Now on your favorite podcast platform. Please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, or to subscribe for as little as $5 a month. Why Now is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers to Political Junkie. Why Now and Political Junkie are written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. Today's theme is by Aaron Sprinkle. You can find his work on Soundstripe. That's all for now, and see you next time.
You could have asked me to do anything. Holding me in the blue light. I guess it's not what you had in mind. Look around now, I see it so clearly. I can't make you believe, can't make you I forgot how to rein it